This videocast is the second of two videocasts that take you through the key points made by Evans in the prologue to his second book of a series of three books he wrote about Nazi Germany. The book is The Third Reich in Power. What he does in this first in the prologue of this book is he summarises the key points from his first book, The Coming of the Third Reich. The first videocast takes you through the first half of the prologue, in which he focuses on Germany from 1871 to 1932. And then in the second half of the prologue, which this videocast will focus on, Evans then refocuses and looks at Hitler and the Nazi Party from 1919, the first year after World War One, up to Hitler becoming Chancellor at the start of 1933. Okay, so let's take the first paragraph. The key point that Evans is making here in this first paragraph is that, yes, after World War One, right-wing extremism grew. Okay, we established that in the previous videocast. The circumstances in Germany, there was a polarisation of the vote, there was disillusionment, especially after the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, with many voters turning away from the centre pro-Republican parties and moving either to the extreme left or the extreme right. The point is, though, that there were numerous extreme right-wing parties, literally thousands of them in Germany in the early 1920s, and the Nazi Party was just one of many. On the whole, disillusioned voters gave their vote to the sort of more established right-wing political party, which was the German Nationalist Party, which was a party that represented the sort of the well-to-do, the upper classes of Germany. But the sort of radical right-wing, the parties that tended to represent disillusioned lower middle classes, were really there were so many of them that they were disorganised and they weren't working together. That none of them were very successful. And Evans quite rightly points out that the Nazi Party, on the fringe of politics, and struggled to make any impact at all. The obvious example of that is they were mainly based in one part of Germany, Bavaria in the south. Okay, they were not a national party. In 1923, which was definitely a terrible year for the Republic, the year of the hyperinflation, the year in which the Belgians and the French invaded the Ruhr, Hitler felt that he could actually have a go at marching on the capital city and seizing power, but it was a complete disaster. It was called the Beer Hall Putsch, or the Munich Putsch, and of course it resulted in Hitler's imprisonment in 1924. So Hitler was not. There was no evidence, really, that he was a future leader of Germany. He entered politics in 1919. His party was on the fringe, but it was one of many parties, very similar parties. Yes, he hit the headlines in 1923, but he was effectively, it failed, and he was sent to prison for a year. And then when he came out of jail, the party went nowhere for the next 5 years. So the period 1919 to 1928-29, there was no real sign of Hitler's political genius that was going to get him into the chancellorship. In the next paragraph, Evans then sort of continues this sort of like theme. It continues really with a very similar sort of thread, critical of the organisation and the impact of the Nazi movement. One of the points he makes out is that the Nazis did not really have a concrete ideology. Unlike other political parties, like the Social Democrats had a Marxist ideology, the Catholic Centre Party clearly had their own set of beliefs and principles, their aims, whereas the Nazis were a very disparate group. I mean, disparate basically means is that there were lots of strands, but they didn't really tie together into an effective bundle, because what the Nazi ideology was basically an ideology of hatred. It tapped into German resentments, and there were lots of negative feelings in the 1920s after World War One. There was hostility to democracy from various groups. There was obviously fear of communism. There was hostility to cultural modernism. There was anti-Semitism. Although Jews were only a 1% minority, there were some Germans who Jews became scapegoats, a target for their resentment. So all of those were sort of picked up by the Nazis and written into their programme. But did they have any sort of concrete positive ideas about what they wanted to do other than attack enemies? Not really. Okay, any positive ideas they did have were very vague, picked up from 19th century extremist literature. Hitler was an avid reader, reading sort of like political tracts, etc. Pan-Germanism, bringing all Germans together into one country. So obviously Hitler was an Austrian, wanted Austria to be part of Germany, for example. A lot of racial ideas about racial cleansing, about eugenics, about weeding out those who were not Aryans, etc. But there was no real concrete political programme. Were they right-wing, were they left-wing? There were elements of both. Okay, at some points of the programme made promises that would appeal to the middle classes and the businessmen. Other parts of the Nazi programme had points that appealed to the working classes. They were trying to be a party for everybody, but by trying to be a party for everybody, in many ways they were a party for nobody, which is one of the reasons that they were not really succeeding in the 1920s to capture any votes at all. Remember, in 1928, in the Reichstag elections, they only got 2.6% of the vote. They were a party that seemed to be going nowhere. However, they did have a talented team, and you know, Evans points out the sort of people such as Goebbels and Goering, etc. And they were very well organised, well prepared. They constructed, after Hitler came out of jail, they constructed a very small but tightly organised party with a lot of energy that was in many ways looking for and waiting for a new national crisis. Now, maybe that was Hitler's great fortune. That national crisis, of course, arrived in 1929. It was called the Wall Street crash. It triggered the Great Depression. And the key features, of course, was mass unemployment, the collapse of agriculture. Now, that had started even before the Wall Street crash in 1927, and the Nazis were starting to win the votes in the countryside even before the Wall Street crash, tapping into sort of rural discontent, small farmers, etc. And then with the Great Depression, mass unemployment. And as we saw in the previous podcast, what that did is it polarised the vote. Many of the unemployed went over to the communists, but the Nazis tapped into fear of communism, and they took advantage. And so the key, obviously the key statistic is, in the Reichstag elections of 1928, the Nazis only got 12 seats. Suddenly, in September 1930, they burst onto the scene after the Wall Street crash, shocked everybody. They became the second largest party in the Reichstag. So they went from nothing to being the second largest party, with 107 seats. That was in September 1930. So, what then happened? Well, in the third paragraph, Evans then moves into the sort of political impact of the Great Depression. What basically happened to German politics? This is the period 1929 to 32. So the Nazis have obviously tapped into the vote. They are becoming a powerful opposition party in the Reichstag, but Hitler is still a long, long way from power. Well, basically the key point is that parliamentary government effectively collapsed in 1930. Parliamentary government had always been weak ever since 1919 in the Weimar Republic. Proportional representation of course, resulted in weak coalition governments. It had always been a struggle for governments to find a coalition of parties to get a majority to pass laws through Parliament. And there had been occasions, even before 1930, when chancellors had to resort to getting laws signed off by the president using that key article, Article 48. But the real difference is that before 1930, Hebert, for example, used Article 48 on a few occasions, but he always used Article 48 to protect the Republic, to make the Republic work, to ensure that extremists did not have a foothold. So Hebert, for example, in 1923 used Article 48 to put down communist uprisings and to mobilise the army against threats such as Hitler's Munich Putsch. But from 1930 onwards, Article 48 was used differently in two ways. One, it was used all the time from 1930 to 32. The new Chancellor, Brüning, didn't even bother attempting to take laws to Parliament. He simply bypassed Parliament. See, he was not interested. Using Article 48, getting laws signed off by President Hindenburg became the default setting. So effectively, there was no pretense of democracy any longer. Democracy had collapsed in 1930. And so be very careful, because students of history will often say, well, Hitler ended democracy. No, democracy really ended before Hitler came to power in 1933. But the second thing about Article 48 is that Brüning didn't use Article 48 to strengthen the Republic. Article 48 was often used to undermine the Republic. Now, what was happening during this particular period? Well, there's that key word, polarisation, okay? The vote has gone away from the parties in the political centre, the parties that support the Republic, such as the Social Democrats and the Centre Party. The vote has gone away to the two extremes. It has gone to the communists on the extreme left, and it has gone to the Nazis on the extreme right. And so the people in power, President Hindenburg and Chancellor Brüning, okay, a picture of him there, stuck in the middle of having to resort to pass laws through presidential signature, not using Parliament. And in the meantime, Parliament is not being used because Parliament effectively is dead in the water. People are taking their frustrations out onto the streets, and the period 1930 to 32 was characterised by political violence on the streets, and in particular violent clashes between the two extremist groups, the communists on the left and the Nazis on the right. So violence became a way of life as part of politics during this period, 1930 to 32. And watching this are in particular the middle classes, and the middle classes are strong believers in the rule of law and order, and they're already frustrated. They have memories of the Treaty of Versailles, they have memories of the hyperinflation of 1923. They have always felt that the Weimar Republic has not really served their interests, and now they're seeing law and order break down. So they're looking for an alternative to the Republic. Evans then moves on to in his next paragraph, the issue about the nature of Nazi support. So as I just said, clearly the middle classes were a key feature. Okay, the main reason why many of the middle classes now started to vote for the Nazis is they witnessed the massive increase in the support for the communists, largely from unemployed workers. And that rise of support for the communists terrified the middle classes. Now, the middle classes had traditionally voted for right-wing parties that were safe, and in particular, Hugenberg's German Nationalist Party. They were the traditional sort of like party of support, the party that the middle classes supported. But now many of the middle classes started to look for an alternative right-wing party. They wanted a right-wing party that was not all about talk. They wanted a party of action that would actually take action to to remove the communist threat. And so in desperate times they looked for desperate solutions, and that's where the Nazis suddenly became appealing. They had not been appealing in the middle of the 1920s. They had been seen to be a sort of like lunatic extreme right-wing group, but suddenly the middle classes started noticing the Nazis. They started listening to Hitler's speeches, not so much what he said, but the way he said it, and in particular the image of strength and action that came from this political party. And so that was the big swing of the vote, and that's why they went from 12 seats in 1928 to 2 years later in 1930, the Nazis got 107 seats, and they became the second largest party in the Reichstag. Only the Social Democrats had more votes than the Nazis in September 1930. So the middle classes have abandoned the conventional right-wing parties, such as the German Nationalist Party. In his next paragraph, Evans then develops this notion further. He starts looking at why people were attracted to the Nazis, what made them appealing, what made them different from other political parties. One of the key points that he makes, I'm just starting in the middle here, is that Nazi appeal actually had very little to do with policies. If you actually, as we said earlier, if you actually look at their party programme, it was called the 25-point programme. It was a sort of like a bundle of lots of promises, but all of those promises were made by other political parties. Okay, the Nazis just simply tried to promise everything to everybody. And they had no real concrete plan other than they were this sort of idea of an ideology of hatred. But in terms of concrete proposals of a plan of what they would do when they took power, there was very little original there. So if people were attracted to them, it wasn't to do with their policies. The reason people were attracted to the Nazis was all to do with image. The image they projected was one of strength and unity, one of action, a party that was capable of doing things, of bringing about change, a party of energy. And remember we said in the previous podcast that Hitler was trying to recreate that spirit of 1914. The phrase "a national community," okay, like the crowds in Germany who gathered there in August 1914 to sign up, where we saw that famous picture of Hitler in the crowd. All social classes standing together, united by the fact we're all German, and in particular the spirit of warfare. So political divisions, class divisions would be replaced with national unity. That was the image. And what the Nazis, as I say, were very, very good at was projecting that image through showing strength, in particular the stormtroopers, the brown shirts, and in particular Hitler's ability to tap into mass psychology through incredibly effective speeches and party rallies. That simply works at a time of national crisis. The other point that Evans makes here in this paragraph is that the Nazis were a catch-all party of social protest. Their core support was middle class, okay, and in particular the Mittelstand, the lower middle class, the artisans, the small shopkeepers, the craft workers, the small farmers. They drew a lot of support from the countryside. On the page here there's a picture there of a typical Nazi propaganda poster targeting the propaganda at the lower middle classes, and you'll see sort of the images of peasants, simple farm people, craft workers and people working on the land. It's what we call blood and soil ideology. That was a key core of Nazi support. But the other thing is they were not a sectional party. All the other political parties appealed just to one social class. The Nazis also tapped into all social classes to some extent. So there were a fair number of working classes who were attracted to the Nazis. Yes, the majority of the working classes stayed with left-wing parties such as the Social Democrats and the Communists, but the Nazis were able to pull some working classes over to their side. And likewise, some Catholics moved from the centre to the Nazi Party and so on. So that's sort of phrase, a catch-all party of social protest, sort of sums them up. And the Nazis were also very good at modifying and adapting their policies to appeal to the different classes depending on the audience. So when the Nazis were electioneering, campaigning for votes in small villages, they would obviously target their message at the grievances of the farmers. When they were working in the cities, trying to get the vote of people in the cities, they would target their message at the frustrations of the urban workers. So they were a very flexible and adaptable party in the way in which they pitched their propaganda. Then in the final two paragraphs of his prologue, Evers moves into this sort of crucial area. Okay, clearly the Nazis were becoming a mass party. Okay, so they were the second largest party by 1930, and then by 1932 the Nazis were attracting even more support. Now, a key part of that was this man, Chancellor Brüning, who ruled Germany, who was the Chancellor of Germany during the key part of the Great Depression. Brüning's solution to the Great Depression was to do very little. He was laughed at by many Germans. He was nicknamed the Hunger Chancellor. Okay, Chancellor Brüning. His photograph was on a previous slide. As we've said, he really ruled by Article 48. He didn't even attempt to talk to the ordinary people, the representatives of ordinary Germans in the Reichstag. He bypassed Parliament using Article 48 and presidential decree to pass his laws. And the laws he passed did very little to address the problems of the Great Depression. Brüning's policy was to simply sit it out and wait for the problems to go away. So the frustrations of ordinary Germans continued and mounted, and both the communists on the left and the Nazis on the right gathered more and more votes during this period, reaching the key point, which was July 1932. Now, in July 1932, the Nazis became the largest political party. They won 37% of the vote. It was not a majority, because remember, proportional representation made it almost impossible for one party to get a majority of the vote, but they got 37%, which made them the largest party. They got 230 seats in the Reichstag. So undoubtedly, of all the political parties, the Nazis were very, very popular, and they were a right-wing party. Now the problem is, of course, Germany was being ruled by right-wing men. Okay, Brüning was right-wing. Hindenburg, the president, was a junker, and the small group of men who surrounded Hindenburg, who were sort of like trying to pull the strings and influence decision making, were industrious. They were right wing, but these men did not have legitimacy. Okay, there's that key word. They did not have popular support on the streets. Okay, why not? Because they were upper class, or they were upper middle class. Now, the Nazis were a right-wing group who were mainly drawing their support and their membership from the lower middle class. And they think of your social pyramid, okay? Think of where the lower middle class were. So the Nazis are a right-wing group that have genuine popularity because they are closer to the people on the streets, unlike the small group of men who hold the power at the moment, who, yes, they're right wing, but they're not in touch with ordinary people. Now, this man here that you're looking at, General Schleicher, was one of many, but he was perhaps the key one. Was the head of the German army at this time, or a key person in the German army, and he was not stupid. He could see that the value of the Nazis. If Hitler could be brought into government, if he could be somehow given the position of Chancellor but controlled by the army, then they would have a right-wing government, okay, that would be able to sell the army's ideas about building up a strong military and developing national strength, that would have genuine popularity on the streets. So Hitler would become basically their puppet. Was sort of Schleicher's idea. So Schleicher was the sort of the string puller behind the scenes throughout the whole of this period. He could see the benefits of getting the Nazis into government in some way. So Schleicher was the man who conspired to put Brüning into office in 1930. He was the man who conspired to then sack Brüning in the summer of 1932. He hoped at that point to somehow bring Hitler into government, because the Nazis had 230 seats in the Reichstag. They were the largest, but Hitler refused to cooperate. Hitler wasn't prepared to be a puppet, have his strings pulled by army leaders. So effectively, Schleicher could get nowhere, and a new candidate was found, a man called von Papen, who became Chancellor after Brüning was sacked. So it's all about now conspiracies in the corridors of power. So what then happened? Okay, in the final paragraph, Evans takes you through the sort of like final act in this drama. Okay, and here we have a key person. Okay, Chancellor Brüning was removed. Hitler was not prepared to accept any position in government unless it was on his terms, so therefore they had to find a new candidate, and they appointed this man, Franz von Papen, as Chancellor, who took over from Brüning. He lasted as Chancellor for 6 months. Now, von Papen was as upper class as you get. Okay, so he was very right wing in his ideals. He was nationalist. He shared many of the views of Hitler, but unlike Hitler, von Papen simply was completely out of touch with ordinary people. He was upper class. Ordinary people just laughed at him, saw him as a bit of a joke. He spent most of his time in gentlemen's clubs, smoking cigars and drinking brandy. He was not in touch with ordinary people. In other words, his cabinet, his government, did not have legitimacy with the people. So for the next 6 months, effectively, the old problems that had mounted under Brüning just simply continued. Okay, the Great Depression is still there. There's still massive unemployment, and you've got a government of Germany of which the people have no real confidence. Now, von Papen was as right-wing as they come. He was anti-democratic, and you could see that in his politics. One of the key things he did, and the second bullet point here, is that he effectively destroyed democracy in the state of Prussia in July 1932. He used Article 48 to get the president to sign off a decree, an emergency decree, which effectively turned the state of Prussia into a dictatorship. And I remember the German federal system, that there were separate state governments, and Prussia was the largest of the state governments, but effectively the state of Prussia became a dictatorship under von Papen. He also significantly curtailed the powers of the Reichstag, as Brüning had done. Von Papen effectively passed laws using Article 48, as Brüning had done, so no real change there. And the key thing is that Schleicher, the manipulator behind the scenes, lost complete confidence in von Papen. And in December 1932, Schleicher he conspired to have von Papen removed from office. Now, at that point, Schleicher himself became the Chancellor of Germany, and this was a key moment. Okay, Schleicher had thought about bringing Hitler into office in July 1932, when the Nazis were at their absolute peak and Hitler had refused to cooperate. But there were elections in November 1932, and the Nazis actually lost 2 million votes. There were many people who were becoming frustrated by Hitler. Why hadn't he accepted the position in government in July? What's the point in voting for the Nazis if Hitler's not prepared to cooperate and go into government? And the Nazi Party was also showing signs of division. Many members of the party itself were frustrated with Hitler, this sort of refusal to cooperate. and wanting all power rather than being prepared to compromise. So Hitler, at that point, at this point in December 1932, the Nazis were looking, frankly, quite wobbly. Schleicher became the new chancellor, and he again was bereft of any real ideas about how to solve the problem. Like von Papen, like Brüning before him, he did not have popular support. He did not have legitimacy, and that's where this man, von Papen, becomes important. He had been forced out of office by Schleicher, and effectively it came down to a very simple plot line in this drama. Von Papen wanted revenge. He had been pushed out of power by Schleicher. Schleicher had taken the top job himself, and now von Papen wanted Schleicher out. And von Papen was very close to President Hindenburg, who was an aging president, easily influenced, but very close friends with von Papen, and he effectively persuaded Hindenburg to sack Schleicher and make an offer to Hitler to become the Chancellor of Germany. And unlike in July 1932 or July and August 1932, Hitler was not really in a position to say no because the Nazis were losing votes. So Hitler was made Chancellor. Hitler accepted the offer, and on the 30th of January 1933, Hitler was made Chancellor. And that offer was made at a time when the Nazis appeared to be weakening. And the terms of the offer will form the starting point of our depth study, okay? Because effectively they offered the job to Hitler on terms that made them feel, the conservatives, that they could control Hitler, that they could effectively box him in and pull his strings, and that he would do their bidding for them. They, of course, were fatally wrong in that they underestimated Hitler's wiliness, his cunning, and of course he was able to break free of the chains that were attached to the offer. But that is another story that concludes the summary from Evans. Thank you.